Hi, I'm Bob, and welcome to Bob's Movie Facts. In this video, we're going to talk about Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. Klingon warbirds, Cold War tensions, and one last mission for the original crew. Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country isn't just another Trek movie, it's a political thriller in space. Released as the world itself was changing, this film throws Captain Kirk and the Enterprise crew into a galaxy on the brink of peace, where old hatreds, conspiracies, and the fear of the unknown threaten to ignite all-out war. With courtroom drama, assassinations, Shakespearean Klingons, and a ticking clock toward interstellar catastrophe, The Undiscovered Country boldly asks whether longtime enemies can truly become allies, and whether our heroes really are ready to face retirement.
Is it possible that we two, you and I, have grown so old and so inflexible that we have outlived our usefulness?
Here are 10 mind-blowing facts about Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. Fact number 1, Star Trek VI almost didn't star the original cast. After the disappointing Star Trek V, it was assumed that the original Star Trek franchise was over. Paramount gave Harve Bennett the green light to reboot the Star Trek franchise and produce a Starfleet Academy prequel movie using younger actors to play younger versions of the original cast. They considered Ethan Hawke as a young James T. Kirk and John Cusack as Spock, and producers referred to the project jokingly as Top Gun in outer space. The screenplay was written by Harve Bennett and David Lowery, the man who wrote Star Trek V: The Final Frontier, and it was going to be titled Star Trek: The Academy Years. The movie would start with an old Leonard McCoy talking to a group of Starfleet Academy graduates on how he met Kirk and Spock, and it would feature the individual childhoods of Kirk and Spock, and then it would move to the Academy Years, where Kirk and Spock would meet Bones McCoy and Montgomery Scott. They would face off against a new villain and then part ways to presumably meet years later on the USS Enterprise. And you can see some similarities as well as differences from the J.J. Abrams' 2009 Star Trek prequel. As you can imagine, this did not go over well with the stars of the original cast, and it created a huge power struggle with Harve Bennett on one side and Shatner, Nimoy, and the rest of the cast on the other. And the situation got very ugly, and even Gene Roddenberry got involved, siding with the original cast. Fortunately for the cast, the 25th anniversary of Star Trek was approaching, and this gave the original stars a little bit of a publicity bump along with some political power. The final factor was Martin S. Davis, who was the CEO of Paramount Pictures' parent company, Paramount Communications, and he was basically Frank Mancuso's boss. And when he found out that the sixth Star Trek movie would not feature the original series cast, he was furious and demanded that the plug be pulled on the Academy Years. He demanded a sixth movie using the original cast. And so, Leonard Nimoy, Gene Roddenberry, and the original series cast ended up winning the power struggle, and poor Harve Bennett lost. Paramount head Frank Mancuso Sr., who had reluctantly greenlit Star Trek: The Academy Years, was forced to side against Harve Bennett, thus ending an epic 10-year relationship between Bennett and Star Trek. And Bennett felt very betrayed by Paramount since he was responsible for the success of Star Trek II, Star Trek III, 4, and 5, and he had single-handedly ushered in the golden age of the Star Trek film franchise, and now he was out. With Harve Bennett gone, Paramount began to develop the final swan song for the original Star Trek cast, a fitting goodbye to the cast and characters that had served the fans for 25 years. Chekhov actor Walter Koenig came up with the idea titled In Flanders Field, which is a reference to the World War I poem, and in the movie, the Federation joins the Romulans to fight the Klingons in an all-out war. The three would then join together to fight a race of powerful, worm-like aliens. And it was rumored in the script that everyone except Dr. McCoy and Spock would die. Unfortunately, it was determined that this film was way too dark to close out the Star Trek film franchise. Fact number 2, Paramount hired Leonard Nimoy and Nicholas Meyer to create Star Trek VI. Now, Frank Mancuso and the producers asked themselves who had benefited the Star Trek franchise the most. And two names came up: Leonard Nimoy, who directed Star Trek 3 and 4, and Nicholas Meyer, who wrote and directed Star Trek 2 and wrote half of Star Trek 4. Leonard Nimoy was made executive producer for Star Trek VI, and Nicholas Meyer was brought in for story ideas. Initially, Paramount asked Leonard Nimoy to direct, but Nimoy immediately refused, because Nimoy did not want to direct, as he felt that if he did, William Shatner would have been jealous, and Nimoy did not want to risk him getting upset and refusing to be in the movie, which would have basically ruined any chance of a sixth Star Trek film. Paramount then hired two screenwriters, Lawrence Konner and Mark Rosenthal, to work with Leonard Nimoy and write the screenplay. Lawrence Konner and Mark Rosenthal were a famous screenwriting team who had written for Little House on the Prairie, Remington Steele, and wrote the screenplay for Jewel of the Nile and Superman 4: The Quest for Peace. And their original idea was to have the original series crew meet Jean-Luc Picard and Data. And this idea was immediately canceled. Leonard Nimoy then went to Nicholas Meyer's house and the two started brainstorming. Leonard Nimoy apparently said, "What if the wall came down in outer space? After all, the Klingons have always been the stand-ins for the Russians, and the Berlin Wall had fallen a year earlier." Then Meyer replied, "Okay, we start with an intergalactic Chernobyl, a big explosion, and we got no more Klingon Empire." The two decided to make a movie, a deliberate story about the contemporary political climate between the US and Russia. Chernobyl was a catastrophic nuclear accident that occurred in the Soviet Union on April 26, 1986, when a nuclear power plant exploded, and it is considered the single worst nuclear accident in history. It added to the economic strain to a struggling Soviet economy, as well as strengthening the mistrust of the world. It also exacerbated the mistrust that the Russian people had of its own Soviet government. Chernobyl is generally considered among historians to be the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. On June 13, 1990, the Berlin Wall was officially disbanded, and in December 26, 1991, a few months after the release of this movie, the Soviet Union formally disbanded and ceased to exist. Leonard Nimoy hired Nicholas Meyer to write the screenplay since Meyer was familiar with Star Trek, and Nimoy knew that he could write fast. He had written Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan in 12 days, and had revised the script for Star Trek IV in less than 20 days. And Nick Meyer wanted to do something different for Star Trek VI. He didn't want to do a hero versus villain story like Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, and he didn't want to do a comedy like Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home. Nicholas Meyer wanted to write a movie that was an ensemble piece as well as a political thriller. While Nicholas Meyer was busy writing the screenplay, the original screenwriters, Lawrence Konner and Mark Rosenthal, were also busy writing their screenplay about the Federation and Klingons creating a peace. And when Nicholas Meyer found out about this, he was confused and upset. However, Konner and Lawrence produced very little usable story elements, and eventually Leonard Nimoy fired Konner and Rosenthal, although the two took Nimoy and Meyer to arbitration and got story credit for Star Trek VI. However, almost all of what we saw on screen was directly written by Nicholas Meyer and his friend, Danny Martin Flynn. Nicholas Meyer and Danny Martin Flynn turned in their completed script for Star Trek VI, and Paramount loved it and greenlit the movie. Leonard also suggested that Meyer direct the film since there was no way he could direct, and Nicholas Meyer's own wife encouraged him to direct the movie. Nicholas Meyer was very excited to direct Star Trek VI. He had just directed a movie called Company Business and had a terrible experience. Company Business was a film starring Gene Hackman and Mikhail Baryshnikov, and it received negative reviews and made on a budget of $18 million. It only made $1.5 million at the box office. And he was eager to direct something he was familiar with to get the bad taste of Company Business out of his mouth. Fact number 3, the original script had an introduction about what the crew had been doing since the last film. Here's something really interesting. In the original script, Nicholas Meyer wanted to establish a little introduction that a certain passage of time had passed in Star Trek V. There would have been individual vignettes about each of the original cast. Captain Kirk would be with Carol Marcus and would be living happily ever after on his farm until a Starfleet officer would come to his door, and Kirk would be escorted to help the envoys gather the original crew and bring them out of retirement. The next scene would go to Spock, who has retired from Starfleet and is now a Vulcan actor. He would be playing Polonius in a Vulcan version of Hamlet, obviously a play on Leonard Nimoy's own life as a classic Shakespearean actor. Leonard McCoy would be introduced, bored and getting drunk at a posh, high-class dinner for wealthy retired physicians. And Chekhov would be in a bar playing chess and losing to an alien. After collecting Chekhov, Kirk would tell him, "You realize that all betazoids are psychic." And Chekhov would be shocked and incredulous and would say, "I was robbed." Uhura would be a host in a call-in radio show and would be bored at her job and would be very happy to see Kirk. Montgomery Scott would be a Starfleet engineering professor lecturing in a large auditorium about the cloaking technology of the Klingon bird of prey, and he would be dismantling the Klingon bird of prey from Star Trek 3 and 4 in front of a large audience of students. The biggest difference would have been Sulu, who was not the captain of the Excelsior, but a taxicab driver in a busy futuristic metropolis. However, in a second script, they decided to change Sulu from a taxicab driver to Captain Sulu, and he, not Kirk, was going to go around gathering the original crew. Unfortunately, Leonard Nimoy and Nicholas Meyer had to abandon this idea, mostly due to budgetary reasons. After analyzing these scenes, they realized that they would have had to film in different locations and create new sets. The cost was estimated at an additional $10 million. And while fun, it would have been way too expensive without adding anything to the plot. Meyer and Flinn tried every which way to hold on to that opening, but Paramount threatened to cancel the film unless the budget was slashed, which meant the opening sequence had to go. The idea had to be discarded. They abandoned the opening sequence and came up with a new scene where Captain Sulu would have his own starship, the USS Excelsior, and his own 5-year mission. And this would also be a really cool callback to the ending of Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, when the crew wonders which ship they'll be assigned to, and Sulu says,
"I'm counting out Excelsior."
Well, it appears he got his dream command. It would be Captain Sulu who would witness the Klingon Chernobyl explosion. Fact number 4, in the original script, it will be Sulu who saved the day against the Klingon bird of prey. Sulu says his 5-year mission was cataloging gaseous anomalies. And this was a setup which would have paid off at the end of the movie when Sulu has the idea that the cloaked bird of prey expels gas, and therefore his ship has the equipment to modify a torpedo that would track the cloaked Klingon bird of prey by detecting the ship's expelled gases. However, William Shatner wanted his Enterprise crew to come up with the idea, so it was changed in the script. Fact number 5, Gene Roddenberry hated the theme of racism in this movie. Nimoy and Meyer decided the movie should have a Gorbachev-like character and created Gorkon. And Gorkon was based on Gorbachev, but also Gandhi and Abraham Lincoln, and his name would be a mixture of Gorbachev and Lincoln, Gorkon. Gene Roddenberry objected to the fact that Kirk and his crew are racist and bigoted toward the Klingons. He believed that bigotry would eventually disappear from the 23rd century and did not want such bigotry depicted in his future universe. Roddenberry and Meyer had yelling matches, with Meyer storming out of Roddenberry's office. The studio ignored Roddenberry and went ahead with Nick Meyer's idea. However, due to Gene Roddenberry's position as creative consultant, Meyer was obligated to show him cuts of the film. They continued to have ugly arguments throughout the filming of the movie, and Roddenberry was 70 years old and was in bad health for someone who was fairly young at only 71 years old. Well, he died 48 hours after seeing the final cut of this film. And Meyer never realized how sick Roddenberry was and always felt guilty for the way they argued in the last few months before his death. And when the film was released in theaters, it was dedicated to Gene Roddenberry. We learn that Spock has been working with the Klingon ambassador to negotiate a peace, and Nimoy has volunteered the Enterprise crew to escort the Klingon ambassador to peace talks at Camp Kittimer. And Captain Kirk, who spent his entire life fighting the Klingons, and who had his own son killed by the Klingons in Star Trek III, cannot forgive the Klingons and cannot imagine a world where the Federation and the Klingons are allies. In the scene where Spock says,
They are dying.
Kirk answers,
Let them die.
and as originally filmed, after Kirk says let them die, he looked shocked by what had just come out of his mouth, and he looked embarrassed and ashamed at the hate that had just come out of him. And this made him much less racist and bigoted toward the Klingons. However, for the final print of the movie, Nicholas Meyer cut this out, and so we get Kurt saying, let them die, and it just cuts to Nimoy being shocked. And this made his character seem much more intolerant and racist, and William Shatner was apparently very upset that Meyer edited out his shocked reaction. And in keeping with the racism motif, Nicholas Meyer sprinkled more callbacks and references to racism in Hollywood movies. In fact, the line, "Guess who's coming to dinner?" is a reference to Sidney Poitier, the story about a black man going to meet his white girlfriend's parents. And it was supposed to be spoken by Nichelle Nichols, but fortunately, she refused to read the line, and it was read by Walter Koenig,
Guess who's coming to dinner?
thereby diffusing the racial tension of the line. Fact number 6, this movie expanded Klingon culture. Nick Meyer had Christopher Plummer in mind when he wrote General Chang, and he had to personally go to Christopher Plummer and convince him to do it. Plummer was friends with William Shatner and was excited to get to work opposite him. Originally, Christopher Plummer was supposed to have a full head of Klingon hair, but while putting on the makeup, he liked the look of the bald Klingon and asked if General Chang could remain bald, and Meyer agreed, and the bald look of General Chang was born. And to complete the look, they added an eye patch that is bolted to a skull. Meyer originally wanted Jack Palance to play the Klingon Chancellor Gorkon, but Palance had to turn down the role to finish up City Slickers. David Warner, who had just played the Earth Ambassador in Star Trek V, ended up winning the role. And when they applied the Klingon makeup to Warner, the artist intentionally made him look like a cross between Abraham Lincoln and Captain Ahab from Moby Dick. They even gave him a walking stick like Captain Ahab, although it had a distinct Klingon twist. During the dinner scene in the movie, Chancellor Gorkon says,
You have not experienced Shakespeare until you have read him in the original Klingon.
And I thought this was a hilarious line at the time, but fine. Two members of the Klingon Language Institute, Nick Nicholas and Andrew Strader, actually translated the entire play of Hamlet into the Klingon language and published it through pocket books. By 1991, Klingon culture was being revered by fans due to the Next Generation TV series, where the Klingons and the Federation had been at peace for over 70 years. And by 1991, fans were dressing up as the Klingons for conventions and learning how to speak the language. They were no longer the villains. And so the idea is that this film would bridge the events of the Star Trek film franchise, where the Federation and Klingons were enemies, to some point sometime 70 years in the future, where the Klingons are allies with the Federation. Fact number 7, ILM created some incredible special effects. At the opening of this movie, when Captain Sulu observes the planet Praxis exploding, we see a shockwave ring explode outwards, and effects were done by Industrial Light and Magic, and they decided to try something new that had never been seen before on screen, and it would indicate the explosion's massive size compared to the tiny starship. And they decided to put in this explosion ring, which would dwarf the giant starship, giving the planetary explosion its scale. And the wave also serves a story in that it causes destruction in its wake, and Captain Sulu has to solve this problem by steering the ship into the wave, thereby showing us his experience and really what he's made of as captain. This shockwave ring was the first time something like this had ever been put on film, and hereafter this effect is going to be known as the Praxis effect. The Praxis effect would be used again and again in Hollywood anytime the filmmakers wanted to depict a huge explosion. It would be used 3 years later in Stargate and used again in 1996 in Independence Day, and it was used again in 1998 in Armageddon, and most memorably used twice in the Star Wars special editions. George Lucas, who owned ILM, used the Praxis effect for both the destruction of the Death Stars in Star Wars A New Hope and again in Return of the Jedi. The Praxis effect has now become a kind of cliche anytime there's a planetary explosion. However, the Praxis effect, while looking visually cool, is probably scientifically inaccurate. Expert astronomers have stated that if there were a huge explosion in space, the shockwave would likely go out spherically in all directions, not in a two-dimensional ring. During the assassination scene, the Klingon blood is shown to be pinkish purple. In the Next Generation TV show, Klingon blood has always been red. However, having a blood-red massacre would have ensured an R rating. By having the blood be pinkish, it assured a PG-13 rating. And the pink blood was supposed to outline the differences between the anatomies of the humans and the Klingons, making McCoy's inability to save the Chancellor Gorkon more understandable and sympathetic. However, the pink blood of the Klingons did not stay in canon long, and Klingon blood reverted back to red after this film. Even by the next movie, Star Trek Generations, Klingon blood was once again shown to be red. This film also utilized CGI to depict the anti-gravity scene where we see pink blood floating in space. And this is one of the first times something like this had been put on film. And it worked very well and really took advantage of this new medium of computer-generated special effects. When Kirk and McCoy are captured, they're taken to a Klingon trial. In the original concept for the scene, Leonard Nimoy and Nicholas Meyer really wanted to showcase the Klingon homeworld, Kronos, for the first time. And this would have been a huge deal for the Star Trek canon. Unfortunately, this would have been very expensive to film. So instead, Leonard Nimoy and Meyer chose a much cheaper and cost-saving option to only depict the trial in the courtroom and then move to the prison planet. At the trial, the attorney for the defendants is Colonel Worf, played by Michael Dorn, who is supposed to be the great-grandfather of Worf from the Next Generation TV show. And for the Klingon court, the production team created the illusion of an endless mass of hundreds of Klingons by using good old-fashioned Hollywood practical special effects creativity. In the front row closest to the camera, there were 6 actors playing Klingons, all wearing full Klingon makeup. In the next row, there were 15 Klingon actors wearing more simple makeup, while the dozens of actors behind them wore inexpensive Klingon masks. And behind them, the production team purchased 200 commercially available Worf action figures and had them rocking back and forth using sticks and tiny motors. Rather than the planet homeworld of Kronos, we get Rura Penthe, the prison planet that is perpetually covered in freezing snow. And for the interior shots inside the penal colony, most of the scenes were shot on a Paramount soundstage, and this necessitated the use of artificial plastic white powder to resemble snow. And apparently this plastic snow got into everything, and the cast and crew were cleaning fake snow from their shoes and socks weeks after shooting the scenes. The entrance of the penal colony was shot inside a large cave in Griffith Park in Bronson Canyon in an old abandoned mine. Only the entrance of the cave was used for filming, but was filmed at night to give the illusion that they were deep inside the caves. For the exterior shots of Ruapente, when Kirk, McCoy, and Mardia travel across the planet, the production team found a huge glacier in Anchorage, Alaska. And this was not an easy sequence to film. This site was not accessible by road and was only gotten to by helicopter. And a second unit team of stuntmen playing the 3 actors flew to the site for filming. And the site was very cold, often reaching negative 50 degrees. And for filming, the stuntmen could only wear wool clothing seen in the movie, causing them to almost contract pneumonia. Fact number 8. DeForest Kelley was paid a hefty salary for appearing in this film. DeForest Kelley, who played Bones McCoy, was also 71 years old and was also in pretty bad health and had considered retiring before the film. However, Paramount offered to pay him $1 million to be in it, and DeForest Kelley decided to sign on for one more film in order to have more money to leave his family. Now, on board the USS Excelsior, Captain Sulu gets a message from Starfleet to assist in the capture of Kirk. And the bringer of this message is a Starfleet officer played by Christian Slater. And Christian Slater was a huge Star Trek fan growing up, and his mother was Mary Jo Slater, who was the casting director for Star Trek VI. He begged his mother to put him in the movie as a small cameo, which she did. And at that time, Christian Slater had broken out in the 1988 film Heathers and the 1990 film Pump Up the Volume and Young Guns 2, and had memorable roles in the 1991 film Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves and Mobsters. And at this time, he was a huge star on the rise. Christian Slater received the minimum scale payment of $750 for his cameo in Star Trek VI, and he never cashed the check, and got the check framed and has it displayed on his wall to this day. Fact number 9, Lieutenant Valeris was supposed to be Lieutenant Savick. In the original script, the part of Lieutenant Valeris was supposed to be Lieutenant Savick. They first approached Kirstie Alley, who was busy filming Cheers, and declined to be in it. Robin Curtis was not approached. And then they approached Kim Cattrall, who had been the original choice to play Savick in Star Trek II. She turned it down, saying that she did not want to be the third actress to play the same character. Therefore, Nicholas Meyer, who really wanted Kim Cattrall in this role, rewrote her as a new character, Lieutenant Valeris. Apparently, Kim Cattrall named the character herself after Eris, the Roman goddess of strife. And Kim Cattrall was already famous for a breakout role as Honeywell in the 1982 film Porky's, and by 1991, her 3 most famous roles were Gracie Law in Big Trouble in Little China, the titular role in Mannequin, and Karen Thompson in Police Academy. However, it would be another 5 years until her iconic role as Samantha on Sex and the City. Fact number 10, Star Trek VI gave the original cast a fitting goodbye. After discovering that Valeris has betrayed him, Spock is sulking in his room where Kirk comes in to check in on him, and he says,
Is it possible that we two, you and I, have grown so old and so inflexible, have outlived our usefulness?
And this line's subtext is clearly referring to the fact that William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy have gotten so old that they can no longer effectively play their Star Trek characters. And Leonard Nimoy said that while performing this line, he began to choke up and he really struggled to film this scene. Now, after the original Star Trek team has saved the galaxy one last time, after 25 years, Meyer wanted to leave them with a perfect screenshot that resembled a curtain call. And this is a nice, touching scene. And what a gift to give the original cast. On board their respective ships, Captain Sulu and Captain Kirk officially say goodbye. And the movie ended with a quote from Peter Pan. And this symbolized the original cast's desire to remain young and play Star Trek forever. Originally, the idea was to have the actors sign off as their characters, and it was a unique idea. However, it was later decided that the actors would just sign off as themselves. Well, how did this movie do? It was made on a budget of $27 million, which was considerably cheaper than Star Trek V. It made $97 million at the box office, and it was also a critical darling with mostly positive reviews. Critics thought that this was a huge improvement over The Final Frontier, and fans felt better about the original cast leaving on this note rather than on the disastrous Star Trek V. The Undiscovered Country was nominated for 2 Academy Awards and won the Saturn Award for Best Science Fiction Film. Bonus fact, Paramount considered making an Excelsior TV series. After this movie, numerous expanded Star Trek universe novelists began to write fan fiction starring Captain Sulu. It turns out that an Excelsior TV show was actually being considered. And in 1996, in the third season of Voyager, in the episode Flashback, George Takei reprised his role as Captain Sulu on the USS Excelsior. And this was planned as a possible backdoor pilot to pitch an Excelsior TV series. A few years later, when Deep Space Nine had finished and was off the air, and Star Trek Insurrection had just bombed at the box office, with the ratings for the last few seasons of Voyager slipping, Paramount wanted to do another Star Trek series to pump some new life into the Star Trek franchise, and one of the ideas considered was an Excelsior series starring George Takei as Captain Sulu. And in the spring of 2000, thousands of Star Trek fans, including the organization called the International Federation of Trekkers, a fan organization of over 5,000 members, encouraged Star Trek fans to write into Paramount showing their support for a Captain Sulu TV series. They were joined by numerous fan groups, including the Media Action Network for Asian Americans, who also wanted a TV show that had a positive depiction of Asian Americans in the media. However, on May 11, 2001, Paramount and Star Trek producer Rick Berman announced the new Star Trek series was going to be called Enterprise, and it would be a prequel about the first voyage of 1701. Many fans, including George Takei, were very disappointed. Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, was a worthy conclusion to 12 years of the original cast on film and serving the fans for a total of 25 years. It was a fun movie that allowed the entire cast to retire with dignity and grace. And those are the 10 mind-blowing facts about Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and thank you for watching.